Somewhere in the vast bureaucratic nightmare that constitutes the galactic registry of sentient disappointments, nestled between filing cabinets marked "Species Too Stupid to Live" and "Civilizations That Peaked Early and Should Have Stayed Home," sat a particular cabinet that had remained sealed for the better part of 3 centuries. The cabinet bore a warning label, written in 17 different languages, all of which roughly translated to "Humans, do not open unless absolutely necessary or unless you enjoy professional humiliation." Today, unfortunately, was absolutely necessary. The being responsible for this catastrophic decision was Vorthak Splendiferous, Senior Competency Assessor, 3rd Class, Subdivision of Remedial Species Management, Department of Cosmic Disappointments. Vorthak was having what could generously be described as the worst day of his 17,000-year career, which was saying something considering he had once accidentally classified an entire moon as sentient and spent 3 decades apologizing to what turned out to be a particularly persistent rock formation. The problem wasn't merely that humans existed. Oh no, that would have been manageable. The problem was that they kept, well, existing, loudly, messily, with an absolutely terrifying tendency to ask questions like, why does that work? And how do you actually know that? And the most dangerous question in the known universe, have you ever actually tested that theory? Vorthak's 17 tentacles trembled as he reviewed the latest Human Incident Report, Volume 47. The previous 46 volumes had been catastrophic enough to give several Galactic Council members nervous breakdowns, but this particular volume contained something that made his chromatic scales flush a deep shade of existential dread mixed with bureaucratic terror. A human named Jeremiah Flabbergast, described in his file as aggressively average with concerning curiosity levels, had somehow managed to accidentally solve the theorem of infinite improbability. Not by being brilliant, mind you, not through years of dedicated study or profound mathematical insight. No, he had solved one of the universe's most fundamental mysteries by making what his own report described as a really stupid mistake that somehow turned out to be completely right, which is honestly more terrifying than if he had done it on purpose. The mathematical proof in question had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds for over 12 millennia. The quantum philosophers of Andromeda had dedicated entire civilizations to pondering its implications. The crystal mathematicians of Rigel had built monument-sized calculating machines that had been crunching numbers for 3,000 years without making progress. The hive mind calculators of Sector 9 had collectively suffered a nervous breakdown just thinking about the problem, and Jeremiah Flabbergast had solved it while balancing his checkbook incorrectly. The Galactic Council of Infinite Wisdom and Moderate Dental Care had reached a unanimous decision after 14 emergency sessions, 6 collective nervous breakdowns, and 1 complete restructuring of their understanding of reality. The humans needed to be dealt with, not eliminated. Oh, no. That would be admitting they pose some kind of threat to galactic stability. They needed to be educated, civilized, transformed from cosmic embarrassments into properly functioning galactic citizens who understood their place in the carefully maintained cosmic order, which was, quite frankly and without any room for negotiation, at the very bottom. The plan was elegant in its condescending simplicity. Selected humans would be brought to the Competency Assessment Center, where they would undergo rigorous testing and training designed to cure them of their dangerous tendency toward accidental discovery. They would learn to think properly, act appropriately, and most importantly, stop stumbling into universal truths like drunken philosophers wandering through a library of cosmic secrets. Enter Jeremiah Flabbergast, age 34. Occupation, freelance accountant with occasional bookkeeping. Hobby, asking questions that make people uncomfortable. Who had just received the most extraordinary letter of his thoroughly unremarkable life. The letter was written on what appeared to be crystallized starlight, smelled faintly of bureaucratic despair mixed with institutional disinfectant, and crackled with energy that made his coffee mug vibrate ominously. The letter began with the words, "Congratulations, you have been selected for mandatory participation in the Galactic Competency Enhancement Program, Subdivision Remedial Education for Dangerously Curious Species. Your attendance is not optional. Failure to comply will result in your planet being reclassified from harmless backwater to cosmic inconvenience and dealt with accordingly. Please pack light. The management is not responsible for existential crises resulting from exposure to galactic civilization." Jeremiah read this remarkable document while eating his morning cereal, a fact that would later be noted in his official file as Exhibit A, Human Inability to Recognize Monumentally Life-Changing Moments. He read it twice, checked the return address, which appeared to be written in mathematics, read it a third time, then shrugged in the particular way that only humans seem capable of shrugging when confronted with the impossible. "Well," he said to his empty apartment, "I guess I should pack a bag." He packed a small overnight case containing 3 pairs of underwear, a toothbrush, some dental floss, a spare shirt, and a well-worn paperback copy of Accounting Principles for Complete Beginners. Because, as he reasoned with the peculiar logic that had made humans such a problem for galactic civilization, you never know when basic mathematics might come in handy, and besides, I haven't finished reading it yet. What Jeremiah didn't know, couldn't have known, and probably wouldn't have believed if someone had told him, was that his selection hadn't been remotely random. He was the human. The one who had committed what the Galactic Mathematical Authority still referred to in hushed whispers as the incident. The human who had solved the theorem of infinite improbability by dividing by 0 in exactly the wrong way at precisely the right moment, while simultaneously carrying the two incorrectly and somehow producing an answer that was not only correct, but elegantly beautiful in its simplicity. The mathematical community was still having collective nervous breakdowns about it. 3 universities had disbanded their mathematics departments rather than try to explain it to their students. The probability police had issued 17 different statements, all of which contradicted each other, and 2 of which appeared to violate basic logic. The transport ship that arrived to collect Jeremiah materialized in his backyard with the subtle elegance of a filing cabinet falling down a flight of stairs. It was called the Inevitable Disappointment, which should have been a significant clue about the nature of his upcoming journey. But humans were notoriously bad at reading signs, omens, or writing on walls, even when the writing was in large, helpful letters that said things like "abandon hope" or "last chance to turn back." The ship's captain was a being called Crix Bumbershot, whose species had evolved specifically to excel at bureaucratic procedures and the careful management of other beings' expectations. Crix greeted Jeremiah with what might have been enthusiasm, if enthusiasm could be legally prescribed as a mild sedative and administered in carefully measured doses. "Welcome aboard, human flabbergast," Crix announced, his voice carrying the kind of forced cheerfulness usually reserved for funeral directors, tax auditors, and customer service representatives who were having very bad days. "I am to be your cultural integration specialist and failure prevention coordinator. Together, we shall embark upon the magnificent journey of transforming you from a cosmic embarrassment into a merely moderate disappointment with acceptable levels of competence." "That's encouraging," Jeremiah replied, immediately demonstrating the human tendency to find optimism in even the most discouraging circumstances, which was yet another reason why humans were considered such a problematic species. "Indeed," Crix beamed with practiced enthusiasm, "your species shows remarkable resilience in the face of overwhelming evidence of your own inadequacy. It's almost admirable in a pathetic sort of way." The journey to the Competency Assessment Center took 3 standard galactic weeks, during which Crix attempted to prepare Jeremiah for what lay ahead. This preparation mainly consisted of explaining, in excruciating and seemingly endless detail, exactly how inferior humans were compared to every other known species in the galaxy, with helpful charts, graphs, and statistical analyses that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that humans were basically cosmic accidents who had gotten ridiculously lucky. "You see, human flabbergast," Crix explained during one of their daily educational sessions while reviewing a holographic chart titled Galactic Species ranked by overall usefulness and contribution to civilized society. Humans occupy position number 47,392 out of 47,393 known sentient species. You are surpassed in general competency only by the blorblings of Sector 7, who spend their entire existence trying to count to 3 but keep forgetting what comes after 1 and starting over again. "What's so impressive about that?" Jeremiah asked, demonstrating once again why humans were considered such a fundamentally problematic species. "The blorblings have never accidentally solved any universal mysteries," Crix explained, with the patience of someone who had explained this many times before. "They have never stumbled into mathematical breakthroughs. They have never inadvertently discovered new forms of energy or accidentally invented technologies that work better than they should. They maintain perfect, blissful, harmless ignorance. They are predictably incompetent." "And that's good?" Jeremiah asked. "It's safe," Crix exclaimed. "Humans, on the other hand, stumble into discoveries like blind creatures wandering through a library of cosmic secrets with their eyes closed, somehow managing to knock exactly the right books off exactly the right shelves. It's terrifying. Do you have any idea how much paperwork is generated every time a human accidentally solves something?" Crix showed Jeremiah the filing system for human incident reports. It occupied an entire section of the ship's cargo hold. The files were organized by category: accidental mathematical breakthroughs, inadvertent scientific discoveries, technologies that work for no discernible reason, philosophical questions that made experts have nervous breakdowns, and a particularly thick section labeled "Things Humans Did That Shouldn't Have Worked But Did Anyway." "This is just the reports from the last 50 Earth years," Crix explained. "The complete archive is stored on a moon." The assessment center, when they finally arrived, was a monument to galactic bureaucracy and institutional learning. It looked like someone had asked an architect to design a building that would make visitors feel simultaneously overwhelmed by its grandeur and completely insignificant in comparison, then given that architect unlimited funding, a serious caffeine addiction, and access to materials that violated several laws of physics. The building stretched impossibly high into a sky that seemed to be several different colors simultaneously. Its walls were covered with inscriptions in thousands of languages, all of which seemed to say variations of "abandon hope of understanding anything," and "please form an orderly queue for existential crisis processing." Jeremiah's first test was labeled Simple Universal Mathematics, which turned out to be anything but simple. It involved calculating the trajectory of imaginary objects through theoretical space while accounting for the emotional state of nearby quantum particles, the political opinions of abstract numbers, and the aesthetic preferences of geometric shapes. The test administrator was a being named Flixworth, tremendously important, who had 17 advanced degrees in things that didn't technically exist, and a deep personal investment in maintaining the illusion that he understood what he was testing. "Now, human flabbergast," Flixworth announced in the tone of someone who had given this speech thousands of times, "this test is designed to measure your basic competency in fundamental universal principles. Please remember that there is only one correct method for solving each problem, and deviation from approved methodology will result in automatic failure and a note in your permanent file." Jeremiah looked at the test. The first question asked him to calculate the square root of purple while factoring in the coefficient of disappointment. He stared at it for several minutes, then wrote down, "This doesn't make any sense. Purple isn't a number. Disappointment isn't mathematical. And whoever wrote this question was probably having a very bad day." For the second question, which asked him to determine the emotional resonance frequency of the number 7, he wrote, "7 doesn't have feelings." Numbers are abstract concepts. If 7 had feelings, it would probably be annoyed at being asked about its emotional resonance frequency. He continued in this vein through the entire test, treating imaginary objects as if they were real, completely ignoring the supposed emotional states of quantum particles, and generally approaching each problem as if it were a practical issue that needed a sensible solution rather than an abstract intellectual exercise designed to demonstrate his inferiority. When he finished, he handed the test back to Flixworth, who reviewed it with growing horror. This is completely wrong," Flixworth declared, his voice rising to a pitch that made several nearby quantum particles hide behind a probability wave. "You've used completely incorrect methodology. You've ignored fundamental principles. You've treated theoretical constructs as if they were practical problems." "But did I get the right answers?" Jeremiah asked. Flixworth consulted his answer key, his face cycling through 17 different colors as he processed what he was seeing. That's not the point. You can't solve these problems by treating them like real problems." "Why not?" "Because that's not how proper mathematics works. These are theoretical exercises designed to test your understanding of abstract principles." "But I found that missing spaceship," Jeremiah pointed out, referring to question number 6, which had asked him to calculate the theoretical location of a hypothetical lost vessel in imaginary space. He had solved it by assuming the spaceship was real, lost, and probably looking for a place to land, then calculating where he would go if he were piloting a damaged ship in that region of space. Flixworth checked his database. The spaceship in question, the theoretical construct, had indeed been found exactly where Jeremiah had calculated it would be. It had been missing for 300 years. The discovery had already been reported to the Galactic Missing Vessels Bureau, who were baffled by how anyone had found it, since it was lost in a region of space that was theoretically impossible to navigate. "This is catastrophic," Flixworth exclaimed. "You've achieved correct answers through completely incorrect methodology. Our entire mathematical framework is based on the assumption that there's only one right way to solve any problem. You've just demonstrated that you can get right answers by doing everything wrong." "Is that bad?" Jeremiah asked. "It's a disaster. It means our testing system is fundamentally flawed. It means centuries of educational theory might be completely backwards. It means—" Flixworth paused, realizing he was approaching dangerous territory. "It means you need immediate remedial education." This pattern continued through every subsequent test. Basic galactic history, where Jeremiah's wild guesses about cause and effect revealed several historical cover-ups that the Ministry of Official History had been trying to keep secret for millennia. Intermediate physics, where his complete misunderstanding of particle behavior led him to accidentally describe a new form of energy that solved 3 different power shortage problems. Advanced philosophy, where his response of "I don't know, but that seems kind of silly" to the question of ultimate meaning caused 3 professors to have existential crises and resign their positions. Interstellar relations, where his suggestion that maybe different species should just talk to each other instead of assuming they know what everyone else is thinking, was recorded as evidence of dangerous naivety, despite the fact that it accidentally resolved a diplomatic crisis that had been ongoing for 200 years. Practical technology, where his approach of "let's try it and see what happens" resulted in him accidentally fixing a malfunctioning anti-grav generator that had been broken for 6 months because everyone was too afraid to tinker with it without consulting the manual, which had been lost during a filing reorganization project. Cultural sensitivity, where his response of, "Why don't we ask them what they prefer instead of guessing," was marked as showing insufficient respect for established protocols, even though it led to the discovery that 3 different species had been systematically misunderstood for centuries because nobody had ever bothered to actually ask them about their cultural preferences. But the real revelation came during lunch break, when Jeremiah found himself sitting with other assessment candidates in the cafeteria of crushing inadequacy. The cafeteria was designed to reinforce the visitors' sense of their own incompetence, with menus written in languages nobody understood, food that was theoretically nutritious but practically inedible, and motivational posters featuring slogans like "Competence is earned through suffering" and "Your inadequacy is the first step toward moderate improvement." Jeremiah was joined at his table by several other beings who were also struggling through the assessment process. There was Bloopsworth, magnificently average, a member of the supposedly superior Quintilian species, who was having what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown over his soup. "I don't understand any of this," Bloopsworth whispered frantically, looking around to make sure nobody was listening. "The mathematics makes no sense. The history sounds completely made up. The physics violates basic logic, but everyone expects me to know these things because Quintilians are supposedly intellectually superior." "So you're just pretending?" Jeremiah asked, demonstrating once again the human tendency to ask obvious questions that nobody else wanted to acknowledge. "We're all pretending," Bloopsworth hissed. "The entire galactic civilization is built on everyone pretending they understand things they don't actually understand. Haven't you figured that out yet?" Also at the table was Florbington, desperately confused, a crystalline entity whose natural transparency made it impossible for him to hide his emotional state, which was currently a swirling mixture of panic and despair. "I've been faking my way through advanced physics for 3 centuries, he admitted, his crystalline structure flickering with nervous energy. "I thought everyone else actually understood quantum mechanics, but nobody ever explains anything. We just nod knowingly and hope nobody asks questions." Sitting across from them was Quibbleton, anxiously incompetent, a representative of the hive mind collective who had been sent to represent his entire species. "The worst part," he whispered, "is that I'm connected to 40 billion other minds, and none of us understand what we're supposed to be doing here. We're all just hoping one of the others knows something, but it turns out we're all confused. It's confusion all the way down." This was when Jeremiah experienced what philosophers would later call a moment of dangerous clarity. "You mean everyone's just making it up as they go along?" "Shh." Bloopsworth looked around frantically. "You can't say that out loud. The whole system depends on everyone maintaining the illusion of competence. If people started admitting they don't know things, the entire galactic civilization would collapse." "But that's ridiculous," Jeremiah exclaimed, his voice carrying across half the cafeteria with the particular volume that humans use when they've just realized something that seems obvious to them, but apparently isn't obvious to anyone else. "If nobody actually knows what they're doing, why don't we all just admit it and figure things out together? Wouldn't that be more efficient than everyone pretending individually?" The cafeteria fell silent, with the kind of silence that usually precedes either enlightenment or catastrophe. Hundreds of eyes, optical sensors, tentacle tip receptors, and various other perception organs focused on this human who had just committed what amounted to the ultimate galactic heresy, suggesting that ignorance might be curable through honesty rather than shameful pretense. A Zephyrian noble named Lady Pompanilla Absolutely Certain, who had been educated at the finest institutions in 17 different star systems and held advanced degrees in things that didn't exist, dropped her eating utensil with a clatter that echoed through the cafeteria like the sound of fundamental assumptions shattering. Did that human just suggest collaborative learning? "I think," said Professor Quibblestone, definitively right, whose entire career was based on never admitting uncertainty about anything, "he's implying that we should ask questions when we don't understand something, and share information openly," added Dr. Flimblebottom, theoretically brilliant, her voice rising with something that might have been hysteria. "Instead of pretending we already know everything." "Madness!" shrieked Director Blunderworth, completely infallible, who had built his reputation on never, under any circumstances, admitting to being wrong about anything. "If we start admitting we don't know things, where will it end? Students might expect us to actually teach them instead of just testing their ability to memorize information they don't understand. Citizens might demand actual competence from their leaders instead of impressive-sounding credentials. The entire social order would collapse." But something had been unleashed. Jeremiah's simple question had cracked the facade of galactic superiority like a hammer striking a wall made of crystallized pretense and institutional pride. All around the cafeteria, beings who had spent their entire lives maintaining carefully constructed illusions of competence began whispering confessions of their own ignorance. "I've been an astrophysicist for 200 years, admitted Dr. Flimberton, theoretically brilliant, his voice barely audible above the growing murmur of confession, "and I still don't actually understand why stars burn instead of just exploding immediately. I've been hoping someone would explain it, but everyone acts like it's obvious, so I just nod and cite other people's papers. I'm a senior diplomatic attaché to 14 different species," confessed Ambassador Quirkington, politically astute, "but I've been winging every single negotiation based on what seemed like common sense, and hoping nobody would notice that I don't actually understand any of the cultural protocols I'm supposed to be an expert on. I run the largest shipping consortium in 3 sectors," revealed CEO Blorgsworth, commercially successful, his voice cracking with the strain of decades of hidden anxiety. "And I've been setting all our freight prices by throwing darts at a board with numbers on it. I thought there was supposed to be some kind of economic theory involved, but nobody ever explained it, and I was too embarrassed to ask." The confessions spread like a virus of honesty through the assessment center. Professors admitted they had been teaching theories they didn't understand to students who were too intimidated to ask questions. Administrators acknowledged they had been enforcing rules and regulations they had never actually read. Scientists confessed they had been conducting experiments without really understanding what they were measuring, hoping the data would eventually make sense to someone else. "I've been approving budget allocations for 17 different departments," admitted Financial Controller Bumbershoot, mathematically precise, "and I have no idea what half of them actually do. I just approve whatever they ask for and hope it's reasonable. I've been writing safety regulations for interdimensional travel," confessed Chief Safety Officer Quibbleton, carefully cautious, "but I've never actually been to another dimension. I just extrapolate from regular travel safety and add warnings about things that sound dangerous. I'm supposed to be an expert on alien psychology," revealed Dr. Florbington, behaviorally insightful. "But most of my reports are just elaborate guesses based on how I think I would feel if I were an alien, which is probably completely wrong." Within hours, the news had spread across the galactic communication networks, with the speed that only truly scandalous information achieves. The shocking revelation that the galaxy's intellectual, political, and economic elite were mostly sophisticated frauds making educated guesses and hoping nobody would notice caused what historians would later call the Great Competency Collapse of Standard Year 2387. Stock markets crashed as traders admitted they had been making investment decisions based on astrology, gut feelings, and the results of dice games. Governments fell as politicians acknowledged they had been making policy based on whatever sounded reasonable during committee meetings where nobody wanted to admit they didn't understand the issues being discussed. Transportation systems shut down as engineers confessed they weren't entirely sure how their own technology worked and were afraid to keep operating systems they didn't fully comprehend. Educational institutions closed as professors realized they couldn't continue teaching subjects they didn't actually understand to students who deserved better. The Galactic Council of Infinite Wisdom called an emergency session, but their opening statement was somewhat undermined when Chairman Blitherton, cosmically enlightened, began the proceedings by saying, "Look, I'm going to be honest here, which is apparently what we're doing now. We have no idea what we're doing, and we haven't actually known what we're doing for about 12,000 years. We've just been hoping nobody would notice and making decisions based on whatever seemed least likely to result in complete disaster." Vice Chairman Flumberton, eternally wise, nodded in agreement. "I've been voting on interstellar legislation for 3 centuries, and I understand maybe 15% of what we actually vote on. I just follow the lead of whoever sounds most confident, but it turns out they don't know either." Secretary of Universal Affairs, Quableston, diplomatically brilliant, added, "I've been negotiating trade agreements with species I don't understand, using economic principles I'm not sure actually work, while pretending to represent the interests of civilizations I've never visited. It's amazing we haven't accidentally started more wars." This admission might have caused universal panic and the complete collapse of galactic civilization, except for one small but crucial detail. Nothing actually stopped working. Spaceships kept flying, even though their pilots admitted they were mostly pushing buttons based on what had worked before and hoping for the best. Communications networks continued operating, despite the technicians acknowledging they had been performing maintenance procedures they didn't fully understand. Planets continued orbiting their stars, apparently unconcerned that their inhabitants had no theoretical understanding of orbital mechanics beyond things fall toward other things, and if they're moving fast enough sideways, they keep missing. Power grids kept functioning, though the engineers running them confessed they had been troubleshooting problems through trial and error rather than deep understanding of the underlying principles. Food kept being produced and distributed, even though agricultural specialists admitted they had been making farming decisions based on tradition, experimentation, and educated guesses rather than comprehensive scientific knowledge. The universe, it turned out, was surprisingly tolerant of ignorance and incompetence as long as people kept showing up, trying their best, and learning from their mistakes. Reality didn't require anyone to understand it completely in order to function within it. Jeremiah found himself at the center of this cosmic revelation, a position that made him deeply uncomfortable because, as he explained to anyone who would listen, "I really don't know anything special. I'm just an accountant who asks obvious questions. If anything, you should all be embarrassed that it took this long for someone to point out that the Emperor has no clothes." But that's exactly the point," declared Crix, who had undergone something resembling a spiritual awakening during the crisis. "You've demonstrated the one skill that truly matters in an incomprehensible universe, the wisdom to admit ignorance and the courage to ask obvious questions." "I'm not wise," Jeremiah protested. "I'm just curious, and maybe a little too stubborn to pretend I understand things when I don't." "Exactly!" Crix exclaimed. "While the rest of us were maintaining elaborate pretenses of competence, you were actually trying to learn things. You were treating problems as puzzles to be solved rather than tests to be passed." This realization led to the formation of the Institute for Productive Incompetence, with Jeremiah reluctantly accepting the position of Director of Obvious Questions, a job title that made him laugh every time he saw it on official documents. The Institute's primary function was teaching beings throughout the galaxy how to say, "I don't know, but let's find out," without dying of shame or professional embarrassment. It offered courses in constructive confusion, the art of admitting ignorance, collaborative problem-solving for former know-it-alls, and how to ask questions without feeling stupid. The results were remarkable beyond anyone's expectations. When the crystalline entities of Proxima Centauri finally admitted they had been pretending to understand their own technology for millennia, human engineers were able to help them figure out why their cities kept randomly changing colors, a phenomenon that had been dismissed as ancient wisdom, but turned out to be a simple matter of unstable molecular bonds that could be fixed with better materials. When the quantum philosophers of the Andromeda Spiral confessed they had no idea what consciousness actually was, and had been making up increasingly complicated theories to hide their ignorance, human psychologists suggested they start by studying simpler questions, like why people preferred certain foods or what made them laugh. This led to breakthrough discoveries about the nature of preference, choice, and decision-making that revolutionized their understanding of consciousness. When the hive mind collectives admitted they had been assuming perfect internal communication, while actually suffering from constant misunderstandings and confusion, human mediators helped them develop better internal communication protocols that dramatically improved their collective decision-making processes. Even the Blorblings, previously considered the galaxy's least competent species, experienced a renaissance when they admitted they couldn't count past one. It turned out they had developed an incredibly sophisticated philosophy based on the concept of oneness that made certain kinds of universal problems much easier to solve. Their approach of treating everything as variations of a single fundamental principle proved remarkably effective for dealing with unified field theories and other complex physics problems that had been baffling traditional mathematicians. The great irony, as Jeremiah observed, while reviewing his first annual report as director, was that the galaxy had become far more competent and effective once everyone stopped pretending to be competent. Spaceships flew more efficiently once engineers admitted they didn't understand the underlying principles and started experimenting with improvements based on observation and trial and error rather than theoretical assumptions. Diplomatic relations improved dramatically once ambassadors acknowledged they were mostly guessing about alien psychology and started actually listening to what other species were trying to communicate instead of assuming they knew what everyone meant. Trade flourished when merchants stopped pretending market forces were predictable mathematical equations and began honestly negotiating based on mutual benefit, actual supply and demand, and realistic assessments of what people actually wanted, rather than what economic theories said they should want. Scientific progress accelerated when researchers admitted their theories were probably incomplete or wrong and started designing better experiments to test their assumptions instead of just finding data to support their existing beliefs. Medical breakthroughs occurred when doctors acknowledged that biological systems were more complicated than their textbooks suggested and began actually observing what their patients experienced, instead of assuming that symptoms should match theoretical expectations. "You know what's funny?" Jeremiah said to Crix during one of their regular philosophical discussions in the Institute's newly renamed Cafeteria of Acknowledged Ignorance. "We've solved more problems in the last year by admitting we don't know things than the galaxy solved in the previous 1,000 years of pretending to know everything." "It's almost as if," Crix mused, slowly stirring his cup of something that might have been tea, but could equally have been a mild stimulant or a cleaning solution. The pretense of knowledge was actually the primary obstacle to learning anything useful. Who would have thought? Jeremiah grinned, raising his own cup in a mock toast. Maybe the secret to not being completely useless in a galaxy full of supposedly superior beings is helping everyone realize that the superiority was the useless part all along. The transformation of galactic civilization wasn't without its complications and growing pains. The former intellectual elite struggled with their new status as professional questioners and collaborative learners, rather than ultimate authorities and sources of definitive answers. Several prestigious universities had to completely restructure their curricula around the radical concept of teaching people to think and investigate rather than memorize impressive-sounding information they don't understand. Many professors experienced what psychologists termed imposter syndrome recovery, a condition in which people who had been actual imposters had to learn how to become genuinely competent at their jobs. Support groups were established to help former know-it-alls cope with the terrifying experience of admitting they had been making things up for decades. The Galactic Registry of Sentient Disappointments was eventually renamed the Universal Catalogue of Ongoing Educational Opportunities, though the filing system remained exactly as confusing as before because nobody wanted to admit they didn't understand the organizational logic. And besides, it had been working reasonably well, despite being incomprehensible. Perhaps the most significant change was in how different species interacted with each other. The old hierarchy based on assumed competence and theoretical superiority gave way to a collaborative network based on honest assessment of actual capabilities and willingness to learn. Humans, once considered the galaxy's greatest disappointment and most persistent embarrassment, found themselves in high demand as competency reality consultants because of their natural talent for saying things like, "Wait, that doesn't make any sense," and "Have you actually tried that? And what happens if we do it this way instead?" The Quintillians, freed from the exhausting burden of maintaining their reputation as intellectual superiors, discovered they had a genuine gift for pattern recognition and data analysis when they stopped trying to impress everyone with how smart they were supposed to be and started focusing on actually understanding the problems they were working on. The Zephyrians turned out to be excellent mediators and counselors once they admitted they had no idea what other people were thinking and started actually asking instead of assuming. Their natural empathy, previously hidden behind layers of aristocratic pretense, made them incredibly effective at helping resolve conflicts and misunderstandings. The crystalline entities proved to be master craftsmen and engineers when they stopped pretending their technology was based on ancient mystical wisdom and started treating it as practical problem-solving that could be improved through experimentation and innovation. Even Vorthak Splendiferous, the senior competency assessor who had started the whole affair by opening that fateful filing cabinet labeled "Humans do not open unless absolutely necessary," found new purpose and satisfaction as director of honest evaluation. His first official act was to ceremonially burn all 47 volumes of human incident reports and replace them with a single page that read, "Humans, surprisingly helpful when you admit you need help. Excellent at asking obvious questions that everyone else was too embarrassed to ask. Recommend for consultation on any problem that has been solved but doesn't actually work." The ripple effects continued to spread throughout galactic civilization in ways that nobody could have predicted. Art and creativity flourished when artists stopped trying to produce objectively superior works according to established criteria and started making things they personally found interesting, meaningful, or beautiful. The results were more diverse, more innovative, and more emotionally resonant than anything produced under the old system of artistic hierarchies. Philosophy advanced rapidly when thinkers abandoned the pretense of having ultimate answers to fundamental questions and focused on developing better questions and more useful ways of thinking about complex problems. Instead of competing to sound the most profound, philosophers began collaborating to create practical frameworks for understanding and dealing with uncertainty, change, and complexity. Technology improved dramatically when inventors and engineers admitted their devices often worked for reasons they didn't fully understand and started systematically investigating why, rather than just being satisfied that they worked. This led to breakthrough improvements in efficiency, reliability, and functionality across virtually every field of technology. Medicine made extraordinary discoveries when doctors acknowledged that biological systems were far more complicated than their textbooks suggested, and began actually observing and listening to what their patients experienced instead of assuming that symptoms should match theoretical expectations. Patient outcomes improved significantly when treatment became more personalized and empirical rather than rigidly theoretical. The great paradox of competence had been revealed in all its absurd clarity. The more certain beings were about their knowledge, the less they actually learned. The more they admitted their ignorance and uncertainty, the more capable and effective they became. Confidence without competence had been replaced by humility with curiosity, and the results spoke for themselves. Jeremiah often reflected on this transformation while walking through the Institute's corridors, which were now lined with plaques bearing wisdom and insights from various species who had learned to embrace their ignorance as a starting point for learning rather than a shameful secret to be hidden. His favorite plaque was contributed by the reformed Blaublings. One is enough to start with. Everything else is just more of what we already don't understand. And that's perfectly fine, because not understanding is the beginning of learning. Another favorite was from the recovering academics. The most important thing you can teach anyone is how to say "I don't know" without feeling like a failure. And from the former authority figures, leadership is not about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and creating an environment where people feel safe admitting when they don't know something. The galaxy had not become perfect, of course. Problems still existed, mistakes were still made, and nobody had figured out why quantum particles seemed to have emotional issues, or why the number 7 appeared to have aesthetic preferences. But these challenges were now met with curiosity rather than pretense, collaboration rather than hierarchy, and honest confusion rather than fake certainty. The Human Assessment Program was eventually transformed into the Universal Continuing Education Initiative, where beings from across the galaxy came to learn the most valuable skill in an incomprehensible universe: how to be productively confused, constructively ignorant, and collaboratively curious. Classes included advanced question asking, the art of productive failure, collaborative problem solving for reformed know-it-alls, how to learn from mistakes without dying of embarrassment, and the extremely popular imposter syndrome recovery for former actual imposters. The program's motto, suggested by Jeremiah and approved by unanimous vote, was simple: we don't know what we're doing, and that's the first step toward figuring it out. Now, Jeremiah's final report as director contained a single sentence that would become not only the Institute's unofficial motto, but also a fundamental principle of the new galactic civilization. The best way to avoid being completely useless in a galaxy full of supposedly superior beings is to help everyone realize that the superiority was the useless part, and the real magic happens when you admit you're all just making it up and start making it up together. Years later, when Jeremiah finally retired from his position as the galaxy's foremost expert on productive ignorance and collaborative confusion, he returned to his home planet to discover that Earth had been completely reclassified in the Galactic Registry, where the file had once read, "Humans do not open unless absolutely necessary." It now simply stated, "Humans, the species that taught the galaxy to ask better questions and admit they didn't know the answers." But perhaps more importantly, beneath that official designation, someone had added in smaller text, "Recommend immediate consultation for any problem that has been solved for a long time, but still doesn't actually work properly." Excellent at pointing out obvious flaws that everyone else was too polite or too embarrassed to mention. The universe hadn't become comprehensible, predictable, or easy to understand, but it had become considerably more honest about its incomprehensibility. And somehow, that simple change had made all the difference between cosmic disappointment and cosmic wonder.